Hello, my name is Skylar Thomas. This is my current events presentation for ESCI 7, Environment, Energy, and Climate, Spring 2022. Sustaining Stupidity. Maybe that's a little controversial. It's attention grabbing, but maybe a little too offensive because it implies that somebody is stupid, usually the consumer. So we could also just call it sustainable, the magical word that allows us to continue down an unsustainable path. Most, if not all of us, are susceptible to effective marketing and lifelong indoctrination. So instead of stupid, I should just say willfully misinformed. Now, I chose this topic because in this class we've used the word sustainable quite often. In fact, on the very first day, it was stated that we need to pursue being more sustainable. What does that word mean again? Real quick. We use it all the time, so I'm sure the definition is right at the tip of all of our tongues. During this course, we have seen how big ag, big tobacco, big auto, etc., have used various tactics to try to slow down progress for private profit. This class, among others that I have taken at this school, do mention agriculture's role in our changing planet, and it's no small role. But we usually kind of just move past that. We're not very comfortable with identifying agriculture as one of the bad guys. For example, it's become somewhat socially acceptable to look at the fossil fuel industry as the evil bad guys. Yet despite the overwhelming statistics and the damage caused by the agriculture industry, we just aren't comfortable looking at them in the same way. But that is the reason I'm choosing this topic, because this industry receives all the benefits that corporations do in terms of political influence, financial assistance, while also receiving all the marketing benefits of small, family, organic. We're just people. We're not corporations, we're just people, but they are corporations. They just get all the marketing benefits. So the current events I am focusing on are Marin County's recent Measure A vote, California's ongoing drought, and a recent emergence of studies that are finally debunking the greenwashing from agriculture, such as carbon farming and regenerative ranching. So why Marin? Well, in my pursuit to save Point Reyes National Seashore, I became very aware of these model ranches. It's as good as it's supposed to get. So if there are problems with it, then we know it only gets worse from there. Now please keep the word sustainable in the back of your minds throughout the presentation. Since Marin County's agricultural pride and joy is the dairy sector, let's first look big picture at dairy in the United States. In 2021, $300 million was given in reimbursement assistance due to the pandemic to the dairy industry. This is an industry that is already dumping millions of gallons of its own product because we have too much of it. An industry that's already propped up with subsidies to the tune of $43 billion in 2016, for example, $34 billion in 2017, and in 2018 it was shown that 43% of revenue came from some sort of government support. 43% of the industry's revenue. USDA data shows that for more than a decade, U.S. farm gate prices failed to meet the price of production, the cost of production for milk. Another report showed that support for dairy in its various forms accounted for 73% of U.S. dairy farmer market returns in 2015. 73%. Now we move over to Marin County, where taxpayers are forced to pay for something that those polled say they don't want to pay for. But as we've learned in this semester, what the people want doesn't really matter when they're up against the political influence that corporate power yields. Corporate power? I thought we were talking about farmers and ranchers. Keep that in mind. Through Measure A, taxpayers have provided Marin County's largest landowners, the ranchers, with $23 million in conservation land easements since 2013. These conservation easements are basically paid out to the ranch families in order to keep doing what they're already doing. because it's so hard to do what they're doing. They've got to be encouraged through multi-million-dollar incentives to keep doing it, because it's so sustainable. At the most recent hearing regarding Measure A, advocates for ranching argued that the money is needed in order to keep these sustainable businesses going. Imagine arguing the need for funds to keep your sustainable business going. Is that not an oxymoron? Imagine presenting this business plan to an unbiased party. Hey, I've got this great plan for a business. I just need you to give me a ton of money every year. I need you to cover my operating costs. Otherwise, it just won't work. Additional Measure A funds benefit ranchers in less obvious ways, such as fire mitigation, which is code for unleashing ranching livestock upon public land to graze vegetation on the public's dime. Free meal for livestock. In fact, not just a free meal, but taxpayers have to pay for that. Why do we have these fire problems in the first place? Oh yeah, habitat conversion thanks to ranching. Interestingly, last year I photographed a ranch that was selling for $6 million. That same ranch had received a conservation easement for $8 million. But they sold it anyway. So you get the $8 million and then you get the $6 million. But hey, why not sell the land? Because that same family has 5 other ranches in Marin County. But let's keep supporting these people. In addition, you also have these carbon programs. Marin County just provided its ranchers with $1 million to pursue carbon ranching efforts, which is just code for not doing it the worst way possible. Or another way of looking at it is the way they should have been doing it in the first place. Now we, the public, the taxpayers, have to incentivize ranchers to do what they were supposed to have been doing in the first place, even though they also hold the mantle of being the ones who, through history, know how to do these things properly. Why do something for free if you can get paid for it? But what I really hate about that is that ranching replaces native plants with deep roots that are actually capable of carbon sequestration with annual grasses that can't sequester carbon. You just have a field of annual invasive plants covered in another layer of poop. And we call that carbon farming. Another rancher received an additional $750,000 to compost, to get his composting business going. Because which farmer has ever heard of composting? Whoever thought of putting compost back onto your land? Why do it when you can get the taxpayers to pay you to do it? Hell, turn it into a business. By the way, one step in his process of creating that compost leads to the creation of a methane pond. Great. Speaking of methane, we also have the concept of methane digesters, which can cost up to $5 million each. 2 ranches have methane digesters in Marin County so far. Well, that was really nice of the ranchers to do the best thing that they could for the environment and try and fight, these emissions. Oh, wait, no. The taxpayers paid for that through state grants. Now, keep that word sustainable in your mind and think about how much we've had to do so far to offset the effects of this industry and the amount of money we have to spend just to keep it alive. Now, this is like putting 1-inch band-aids on top of a gushing, massive wound and saying that we're solving the problem instead of actually sewing up the wound. Maybe we should just move on from something that is so harmful. Oh, fun fact. Marin Agricultural Land Trust, responsible for dishing out these funds, has board members that are family members of the same ranch families that this organization decides to give the money to. Finally, after independent investigative journalism, this was investigated for conflict of interest, but that still hasn't stopped the organization from bringing in millions of dollars of private and public funds every year just to be redistributed to those ranch families. According to the University of California's Cooperative Extension, 50% of Marin County's acreage is devoted to agriculture. 50%. According to that same document, the average farm size is 588 acres. Imagine requiring 588 acres to produce your product and still needing various forms of federal, state, and local support just to operate and produce something that you can claim is important to the economy. Now, how many people are uncomfortable so far with my onslaught of the ranchers and farmers? Yeah, messed up, right? Be really messed up if I was making any of this up. No, what's messed up is converting a beautiful biodiversity hotspot like California into the hellscape that you see here. Calling that conservation is what's messed up. And it costs the taxpayers a lot of money for this quote-unquote conservation to take place. Now let's factor into current events California's ongoing drought. In fact, the worst drought that we've seen. More funds, in addition to the funds that I've already mentioned, are distributed in order to help ranchers get through these dry times. We're giving more water from harder to get places, providing that water to the people who drained the land of water in the first place. A dairy cow can drink up to 50 gallons of water per day. One of the quote-unquote small sustainable dairies in Point Reyes used 200,000 gallons per day. I wonder where the water went. I mean, obviously it's not raining, but does anyone think that the groundwater and the wells and the reservoirs might be going dry for any other reasons? But let's not move on. Let's not move on from that. Let's call it sustainable and shell out more money in order to get water to these extremely thirsty industries. As someone who has carried water on his back into the wild for animals that I've literally witnessed dying of thirst before my eyes, it is particularly concerning that instead of thinking about the consequences on the wildlife, ranchers are instead allowed to pump water from what little water remains in order to keep their sustainable businesses going. And did they fit the bill for this? No, silly, you did. Marin County's DRAWS program last year allocated $500,000 to assist ranchers in the drought. Many ranches were already having to truck in water because their local sources of water were depleted. But in a case such as in Sonoma, where they quietly approved the spending of $400,000 to resurrect a dormant well, that water was now made available in order to be trucked to needy ranchers. Let's spend more money to find what little water is left. Kind of reminds me of hydraulic fracking. To find what little gas is left instead of just moving on from an industry that we should have already moved on from. Now, lack of water also means lack of quality forage because plants need the water in order to grow. Now, instead of thinking about how that has affected the wildlife, the thought goes to, oh, it's going to be more expensive for the ranchers to feed their livestock as well, not just to water them, but also to feed them. So now the feed has to be trucked in as well. Who fits the bill for that additional cost? Programs, tax-assisted programs. There's even a livestock disaster forage program that gives out $125,000 per applicant if you can show that you suffered from the drought. Side note, during my reading, one farmer was lamenting how his orchard trees were so dry that they were a fire hazard now. It just shows our cognitive dissonance to not think of all the wild trees, the forest trees, that we steal all the water from and turn them into fire hazards as well. And instead only focus on industry trees and the people who have historically drained the water because of grandfathered water rights that allow them to use as much as they want, to the point to where it's all used up and then they have to truck it in. Human activity, particularly agriculture, drains creeks, empties rivers, empties ponds, empties lagoons, forces us to empty reservoirs, empty aquifers, empty wells. Has anyone considered that perhaps the deep roots of trees rely upon that underground water in order to not go dry? Has anyone considered that other creatures need that water to remain in the soil for reasons that we don't have to understand, but there's a pretty good bet that it's supposed to be there? Okay, we're already at 15 minutes. I better cut it there for part one. So, have you been calculating in your head the amount financially that is required to support these businesses? Have you calculated in your head the amount of land required for these businesses? Have you calculated in your head the amount of water required for these businesses? And are these calculations causing you to come to the conclusion that this can be called sustainable by any means?